risk management framework is not equal the risk assessment, right? So we really need to make sure that we are following this step. So, and this is directly from NIST and some parts of 31,000 as well. So we really need to categorize, select, implement, assess, authorize, and monitor, right? And this, mind you, this is an ongoing process. This is an ongoing process, and this should happen on a periodic basis. And the periodicity could really differ from company to company, and the sort of risk assessment that you are trying to conduct on a particular business, maybe on a particular service, on a product deployment, on a product itself, right? It could really be anything. However, we'll start from the first. So the first one is really categorizing. So when we say categorizing, it's categorizing the assets and the risks here. So we are really trying to understand what different assets do we have in our organization, right? Because if you really don't know that what sort of assets do we have in my organization, or what do we really need to protect, that would not really make sense, and that's not a good starting point. So we need to understand that what are the assets do we have in our organization. Categorize them. Either you could categorize them based on hardware, software, tools, technologies, virtual servers, network devices, could be anything based on your nomenclature that you have defined, and then categorize the risk in each of those assets, right? Once we have done that, the next step is to select the right controls. Is to select the right controls. Sure. So the risk could be categorized by your operational risk, right? It could
Oh,
be your technological risk as well. At times, technological is also embedded into operations. It could be your financial risk. It could be your strategical risk, right? It could be a strategical risk as well. And it could be your regulatory and legal risk too, right? So these are the set of risks that we are speaking of. And this is something that we would also be discussing largely
mm,
when we go into the risk assessment sheet, and how do we do that on a very high level, right? And how do we quantify that as well? So we'll discuss on those in quite detail. Don't worry about that.
sure.
So really the idea is to categorize the assets and the risk, both of them, which is really important. And then you can map the risk against either each of those assets type that we have categorized, or we could really say that these are the set of risks that we have identified from my types of assets, right? The next process is to really implement the right controls, right? Because we really need to understand the cost benefit analysis as well, right? And I think I've already mentioned in some of my previous sessions as well, that I'm a big preacher of cybersecurity is not only about your technical controls, right? It's more of bringing in the technological aspect to your business acumen as well, right? And that's where the identification or the selecting the right controls is very crucial and is really vital for your organization. And this is because you may have all the tools and technologies available out there in the market, but you really have to understand that what value are you getting out of it, right? Because say if you're implementing a SO tool out there, right, for your internal SOC team, which would really cost over $20,000 or $25,000 for a single license, right? Now, what sort of value are we getting from there, right? Are we reducing the threat vector and the threat exposure to a level which is much higher than $20,000, right? Because if it is not, we are really just spending money on some fancy tools that we really don't need, right? So it's really able to understand those business language and making sure that we are selecting the right controls. It's not always the advanced level of controls, but it's the right amount of control to make sure that our risk is being mitigated to an acceptable level. The next one is the implementation of these controls, right? So once we know that what sort of controls do we need to have around a certain risk, we need to start implementing those, right? And if we have not yet, so say for large corporations, obviously most of the controls, I would say more than 90% of the 95 to 90 to 95% of the controls would always be implemented. But if you're starting off with some of the SMBs, right? If you're starting off with some of the SMBs and you're really trying to implement some of those controls, it becomes a pain for you, right? Because you'll have to not only implement on a governance level, but you would also have to implement from a business unit, from the business, talking with the business unit heads and who not, right? And it becomes a real pain when you start to try and implement some of those tools, because you would not only have to make sure that you're implementing the right tool, but also in a right manner and within the given timeline, right? And at the same time, you also want to make user aware how to use that for the relevant stakeholders. Say someone who's actually working on the tools and technologies, they would want to know that how exactly the tool works, because if they don't know, then it's really no point in um, you know implementing some of those expensive tools if it cannot be used by, or if the internal team doesn't have really the capability. So this step also complements the selection of tools as well, right? And we really need to think forward what we discussed in the previous slides, some of the previous slides, wherein we really need to think forward that the controls that we are selecting, can we implement that in a timely manner? Can we do that? And is it really valuable for us? Is it really giving us the cost benefit analysis? And I know that from some of the larger corporations out there, from a line 2 perspective, these sort of conversations would only happen between the senior leadership management and maybe some of the senior level people out there who's actually working in the who's actually working closely with the risk managers and whatnot. But on a ground level, this may or may not happen, right? So, however, even if it is not happening, and you see that you really want to get into those sort of conversations, because from a career perspective, it really take you far once you know that how exactly a cost benefit analysis is done and how is it presented to the senior leadership management. And that's where the selection of the tools, selection of the controls and the implementation of the controls would happen. The next one is assessment, assessing the controls that we have implemented and the risk as well. But assessing the risk would largely happen in the monitoring session, right? So can someone say, when we say assessing the controls, what exactly are we assessing and how do we assess that? This is something that we have already discussed in some of the previous sessions as well. How do we assess a control, and how do we make sure that it is working as expected? So the entire assessment, implementation of the control, so this is the entire assessment, right? So the assessment would not only include your categorization and selection, but it also include your implementation and assessment as well. However, the overall risk management framework, from a framework perspective, it would also include your authorization of the risk and controls and monitoring the risk and controls on a periodic basis. So this will include from a larger or from a wider risk management framework perspective. But from an assessment perspective, it would largely be your categorization, selection, implementation, and assessment of the risk and controls. So yes, you're right. So from a design and operating effectiveness perspective, from a design perspective, we look at whether or not the process that we have implemented is the right way to go about it, right? And whether or not we have documented it properly from a roles and responsibilities perspective, documenting the policies and the procedures perspective, right? The other way to go about is the operating effectiveness. So Abhilash, to your point, VAPT would be a part of your operating effectiveness and not the operating effectiveness itself, right? So VAPT could be performed on the systems and tools that we own and that we manage. However, we should also be looking at whether or not it is operating effectively. That means from a VAPT perspective, from a design perspective, we say that we should be conducting pen test annually, right? Now, from an operating effectiveness perspective, we know that we are conducting VAPT, but are we conducting on an annual basis would be something that would fall under the operating effectiveness, right? And for the other controls, like your third party risk management, right? Third party risk management, which is a bigger risk out there in the market right now. And this is something that we all should be really mindful of, because we are really using and relying on some of the services that are critical to the firm on third parties, right? So from a third party perspective, we should have proper governance. We should have We should have a detailed agreement. We should have SLAs. We should have NDA. We should also have some of the other clauses related to your incidents and those sort of stuff, right? So these requirements become your design effectiveness. So whether or not have we defined that in the first place from a process perspective, have we defined the shared responsibility appropriately for the wider audience to be, when I say wider audience, it's your senior leadership, your stakeholders who are actually working on it, line one, right? And your third parties themselves. So they should be knowing whether or not do we have these processes in place. And from an operating effectiveness perspective, if you're saying that we are governing them on a quarterly basis, right? So from an operating effectiveness perspective, that means we'd be looking at some of the sampled quarters, and we'd be looking at whether or not we have actually done any governing activities, right? And similarly for agreements and NDAs and other controls, any control for that matter, right? So the assessment of control is really important, because once we have implemented it, we really need to make sure that those controls are operating effectively over a period of time, right? It's not just set and go sort of stuff. It's not a once-off activity, right? So if we have say if we have deployed an antivirus, right? We have deployed on-prem antivirus server, and we have deployed antivirus across all my endpoints, right? And that's from my implementation perspective. That's from my implementation perspective, wherein I have reduced some of the risks identified out there, right? Now that we have done that, are we making sure that the antivirus definitions are updating on a regular basis? Are those definitions being pushed to all the endpoints in a timely manner, right? Whether or not there are any exceptions, and are we handling that or not, right? So those sort of assessments needs to be conducted and drafted out in the risk management framework from this process perspective. And the next one is really authorizing. So when we say authorizing, it's mostly on authorizing the risk and controls that we have already determined on from the selection, implementation plan, and the assessment plan. So these are all in the planning phase, right? So once we have planned everything, it is authorized, it will go live, and all your controls would be implemented, and everything would be authorized, and the entire risk management framework would be live. This is from a perspective wherein we are deploying, or we are trying to implement risk management framework for the first time, right? If this is an ongoing basis, the last step, which is the monitoring step, would kick in, right? And this is something that most of you would be already aware of, that the risk management framework should be reviewed on an annual basis to the least, right? Or if there are any major changes during the one year mark. So if there are any major changes, or if we have completed a 1 year mark, the risk management framework should be reviewed for its adequacy, and whether or not is it still relevant to my organization, and whether or not is it still operating as expected, right? The other part of the monitoring is monitoring your risks and controls, right? The other part of the monitoring are these, wherein from the risk perspective, we are meeting the business unit heads on a periodic basis. So say for the critical ones, we would be meeting them on a quarterly basis, right? We'd be meeting them on a quarterly basis. We'd be reassessing the BIA that we have conducted, your business impact analysis that we have conducted. And once we have done that, we'd be looking at any emergent risk as well, right? I have a question on this one from a monitoring perspective. So say that I have determined an inherent risk. I have determined an inherent risk, and I have determined my residual risk, right? I've determined these two. Now my inherent risk on a scale of 1 to 5, wherein 5 is catastrophic and 1 is really low, my inherent risk was 5, and my residual risk is 2 at the moment, right? Now, when we talk about the monitoring part, as in monitoring the risks and monitoring the controls, right? In certain situations wherein my risk and the controls that I have applied, say C1, C2, C3, C4, whatever we have applied, my inherent risk was 5 and my residual risk is 2. Do we or do we not, on an ongoing basis, we focus on this particular risk, since my residual risk is already low at the moment, and it's within my acceptable level. So should we or should we not focus on this risk on an ongoing basis from a monitoring perspective? Or should we say that for this particular risk, we would be monitoring on an annual basis, and for other risk which are for those whose residual risk is say 2 or 3, we would be monitoring them on a quarterly basis, more frequent, right? So do we adopt to that methodology, or do we give importance to every risk equally? I mean, what exactly do we do? So we really need to be mindful, and this is something that from an organization perspective, some of them, I wouldn't say most, but some of them would have a different perspective on this one as well, right? However, having said that, each and every risk should be treated equally, because there could be a situation wherein this particular risk at the moment, the inherent risk is 4. However, maybe or may not, in the next 1 to 2 years, this may increase to 5, wherein my risk rating, the inherent risk rating might increase, right? It doesn't matter where my residual risk is sitting right now, right? If my inherent risk is 5 at the moment on a scale of 1 to 5, then we really need to make sure, say if it is at 3 or 4 at the moment, right? And we really need to make sure that going forward, my inherent risk, is it increasing or not, right? Is it moving to 5 or not? And in other scenarios as well, in some of the other scenarios wherein my inherent risk is 5, maybe in another couple of years the inherent risk might decrease as well, right? Maybe due to adoption of some advanced capabilities, enhanced technologies, wherein this risk is no more applicable. Maybe there would be some other emergent risk and threats and whatnot, but at least this risk is not applicable, right? So there could be variants of scenarios out there in the market from a cybersecurity threat landscape perspective, which is why it's really important to make sure to treat each and every risk equally. We cannot afford to do that. Also, at the same time, when we talk about controls monitoring, right? Controls monitoring, do we do that on a periodic basis? Do we treat the controls equally as we are treating the risk, or do we prioritize some of the controls and test the operating effectiveness appropriately? How should we go about this? Say that if a particular risk is 5 at the moment, right, which is catastrophic for me, right, and I do have some controls to mitigate and whatnot, right? But over a period of time, if my inherent risk of that particular risk is becoming low, and I have, all the advanced level of controls as it shouldn't be, don't you think my operational overhead would be much higher on that particular risk if the inherent risk rating is dropping below 5, or maybe dropping over a period of time? The amount of effort that I would be putting in to reduce that risk financially, operationally, resource wise, would be much higher than it actually should be. So this is more or less on the monitoring side of it. On the controls monitoring, there are two ways to go about it. Either you could treat all your controls equally, wherein we say that all my control, we would be looking for operating effectiveness for all my controls equally. Or you could prioritize some of the controls which is really important and which is really critical for you, um, from an operating effectiveness perspective. And obviously line 3, which is the internal audit, would have another independent view on your controls effectiveness as well. So from a risk perspective, we would anyway be selecting, implementing, and assessing the controls from our end in conjunction with the line 1, which is really the business, right? But line 3 would also have an independent view on the controls monitoring on a periodic basis. They could either do a 3-year audit plan, right? Or they could do a 5-year audit plan, wherein they would say that we would be assessing the controls that we have in place in our organization, um, in our organization, from a 3-year audit plan perspective. So say the first year we would be assessing on access control, network security, and blah 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 blah, a number of areas. In the year 2, we would be going for HR, procurement, asset management, asset lifecycle management, sort of stuff, blah blah blah, right? So it just depends that what is the methodology that line 3 is taking, And line 3 cannot be, from a controls monitoring perspective or controls assurance perspective, line 3 cannot be influenced by either line 1 and line 2. It's totally dependent on line 3 or the internal audit. What approach do they want to go for? Either they want to complete all the controls testing in the single year, right, within the same year, or maybe within 2 years, or they would want to have a 3 year or a 5 year audit plan. So it's really up to them. And it's up to the senior leadership management, as in who would be the final accountable person for the line from the line 3 perspective. So this is pretty much it from the risk management frameworks perspective, right?